Anaxagoras of Clazomenae is a Greek Presocratic philosopher who lived in the 5th century BCE, and he's most famous for the theory that mind is the master element in the universe. It's the controlling element that set everything in motion and organized the universe as we see it. We explored this in a previous episode on Anaxagoras, but today I want to talk about another one of Anaxagoras' fascinating theories, and that's the idea that there are many worlds with their own suns and moons and stars elsewhere in this great cosmos, and that we live in a sort of multiverse, and that there are other pockets of universes within the great cosmos where there are other humans living on other Earths with other suns and other moons and other stars, and that's what we're going to be exploring on today's episode of The Living Philosophy. First thing you got to understand when you're approaching Anaxagoras' worldview is that the point of view of someone who lived in the 5th century BCE is obviously going to be very different from the 21st century. Their conception of the universe and space is just completely different. And that's not just the pre-rational outlook like you'd see in Hesiod or Homer, but when it comes to Anaxagoras, you've got something that's even more idiosyncratic because it's coming out of a pre-Socratic tradition of philosophizing. And in particular, you can't really understand what Anaxagoras is doing without Parmenides. And Parmenides was like the Descartes of ancient philosophy. He's the pivot point. He's caused a paradigm shift in the way the philosophy worked. Because in his poem, so he wrote this one work on nature, which is divided up into a proem, like a prologue poem, the work Aletheia, which is the way of truth, and the doxa, which is the way of opinion. And in the way of truth, Parmenides crafted an argument 2,500 years ago that is still relevant and still debated in philosophical circles today. It's the first sustained argumentation in the history of philosophy, and the argument of Parmenides seems to incontrovertibly show that the nature of existence is one. So it's one, it's undividable, it's unchangeable, and it's timeless. So the challenge facing Anaxagoras and all the later pre-Socratics was how to reconcile the nature of being and the impossibility of not being that Parmenides had highlighted, and that oneness, that unchangingness, how to reconcile that with the clearly constantly changing nature of the world. As Heraclitus put it, you can't step in the same river twice because more waters flow over it, more waters flow over that again. So it's this thing of the pantarei, the constant change that's happening. So these philosophers after Parmenides had to try and reconcile these things together, and it seems that even Parmenides' doxa, that third part of his book that comes after the way of truth, the way of opinion, it seems like that is an attempt to reconcile this nature of reality as it is with the nature of reality as it appears. And so this is the background against which Anaxagoras' philosophy, out of which the idea that mind is the master element and the multiverse comes out of, that's the backdrop to this. So the question for Anaxagoras is, how do we reconcile the unchanging nature of things with the seeming constantly changing way of things? And Anaxagoras does this with his concept of seeds, and the seeds are atoms essentially, and these atoms are things like warmth, light, wetness, dryness, heat. So all the different qualities are these different atoms. And these individual atoms are unchangeable. Each atom meets the constraints of Parmenides' theory. They're unchanging, they're eternal, and they're whole. And the way Anaxagoras imagines the universe is as a plenum is you got all these elements and they interpenetrate. So it's not like they're solid things bouncing off each other, but it's more like an ink or a dye going into water and spreading out. So they can interpenetrate. The different traits can be in the same place. So you can have dryness and wetness and brightness and darkness, and depending on which elements are more there, that are more present in a certain region of the plenum, then that's the traits that you get. So with a fire, obviously there's more traits of heat and dryness around it, even though the traits of coldness and wetness are there as well, but it's the dryness and the heat that predominate where there's fire. And so the nature of the universe in its primal state is just a big soup of these primal elements that are all mixed together and they're all evenly spread out. But because these elements can interpenetrate with each other, they can't actually cause any motion, and that's where mind, Nous, as Anaxagoras calls it, comes along. And Nous is a separate element. It's separate to these other traits. It's independent, and it causes things to start moving, and it creates this great spiral, this great whirlpool. And the whirlpool starts to drag the different elements around and starts to mix everything up, and it's that nature of the mixing that leads to the reality that we have today, that you've got more heat over here and more cold over there and more wetness over here. So it's the the different traits get mixed about. And this mixing about of these unchangeable elements is what creates the illusion of change. And that's how Anaxagoras goes about reconciling the world in actuality of unchanging units with this world of appearance. And so it's just actually the motion that we're seeing, but everything is actually unchanging. So that's how he goes about reconciling the challenge of Parmenides with the reality he observes in the world. But this strange cosmogony of the Nous, the mind being the element that stirs everything up and causes a whirlpool of these elements, is the same thing that leads to the multiverse. Because if you've got this big plenum, this big field of elements, and you start a whirlpool over here, there's nothing stopping mind from starting a whirlpool over here and over here and over here. So you've got all these different universes that are independent. And Anaxagoras talks about all this in fragment B4a, which goes like this. Since these things are so, it is right to think that there are many different things present in everything that is being combined, and seeds of all things, having all sorts of forms, colours, and flavours, and that humans and also the other animals were compounded, as many as have soul. Also that there are cities that have been constructed by humans and works made, just as with us, and that there are a sun and a moon and other heavenly bodies for them, just as with us, and the earth grows many different things for them, the most valuable of which they gather together into their household and use. I've said this about the separation off, because there will be separation off not only for us, but also elsewhere. And this conception of Anaxagoras is so bizarre that commentators, both ancient and modern, have tried to find some other way of explaining it than the multiverse theory. So one is that Anaxagoras is talking about a different place on Earth, or that he's talking about the moon, because in Anaxagoras' conception of the universe, he was the first person to argue that the sun is actually just a distant body. It's not, the sun isn't the size of, the little circle in the sky. He argued it was the size of the Peloponnese, the Greek peninsula, which is he's on the right track, but obviously now knowing the size of the sun, he was a good bit off. And so it's argued that maybe the moon could have been a thing, because the moon was considered another heavenly body. So like the sun, it would have been distant, but there would have been space there. So one interpretation is that it's somewhere else on Earth that he's talking about. Another interpretation is that it's the moon. There's no one really arguing that it's the stars in his conception. That's where it doesn't map over with our 21st century conception, because the stars for Anaxagoras are just fiery rocks. So it's not like they're separate star systems. But the thing that really blows all those out of the water is that he says they have their own sun, they have their own moon. So the way he puts it, there are a sun and a moon and other heavenly bodies for them, just as with us. So that wouldn't really make sense if they were somewhere else on Earth or on the moon. They would be sharing the same sun, and if they're somewhere else on Earth, they'd be sharing the same moon. So another kind of argument that's been put is that he's talking about a microcosm. So within us, each of those elements, the complexity can happen on every level of reality. So if you go down to the microscopic level, then there could be homunculi, so whole worlds of people and other stars and moons maybe within us. So that's another conception, but that's kind of been thrown out as well. So the only one that really makes sense of the fragment is this interpretation of the multiple originations, the multiple starting points of Nous, so testing out these different things. And what I love about this theory of Anaxagoras is how very different it is from our view of aliens. So the modern kind of view of aliens is, I guess, coming from our view of evolution and the kind of idea of the little grey man. Aliens are seen as, they're seen as something completely other, something completely different and maybe nefarious and operating underground if you're kind of a conspiracy theorist, or else we just imagine them as something completely and utterly different. But I like this view of Anaxagoras of alien worlds where there are other humans doing the same thing, and it's rather than emphasizing the difference, rather than seeing the otherness of the alien world, it's the sameness. They're doing the same things as if they've got their cities. They're gathering together the most valuable stuff and accumulating them as well. And so it's the sameness between us and those alien worlds. And I think that there's something, I don't know, it just gave me a different way of looking at this idea of aliens. And I just thought it was kind of interesting. I mean the whole thing is fascinating that this guy 2,500 years ago is conceiving of a multiverse. And of course it's coming from a completely different point of view, which makes no real sense because he's arrived at it through the logic of Parmenides, and God only knows how he got to the idea of this plenum and the mind being something separate. Aristotle kind of came along later and criticized him for underutilizing his concept of the Nous, concept of the mind, and not really fleshing it out as much as he could have, or explaining it. It's kind of just a deus ex machina. But it's fascinating to look through the eyes of this ancient man and to look at alien worlds and other universes, not through a kind of a fearful lens, but through a sort of a sameness, through sort of a kinship, because we're all related together by this greater mind, by this the Nous, the mind principle that is organizing everything. And so if it's organized this universe, it's also organized that universe, all within this great field of cosmos. So that's just what I wanted to explore on today's episode of The Living Philosophy. If you've enjoyed it, please subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have any thoughts, feedback or comments, I'd love to hear from you down below. And otherwise, I shall see you next time. Thank you for watching.